The alarm on my wrist device screamed before I even opened my eyes, and I knew something had gone wrong. My name is Maya Osei, and on that morning I was the only human sitting inside the grand chamber of the Galactic Council when the first shots were fired near the Kesserin Belt. I did not know yet that those shots would change how every species in this galaxy looked at my planet. I remember gripping the edge of my seat as the holographic display above the chamber floor lit up red. Red meant conflict. Red meant somebody had broken a treaty. And when I saw the coordinates flashing on the screen, my stomach dropped, because that region belonged to Earth. 300 delegates turned their heads toward me at once. Not with concern, with amusement. I could feel it crawling over my skin like static. A Thren admiral named Kaylor Vaughn stood up first, his silver eyes gleaming under the chamber lights. He did not even bother lowering his voice. "It appears our newest pets have found their claws," he said, and the chamber erupted in a wave of clicking, humming, and low mechanical laughter from a dozen different species. I sat perfectly still. I had learned, over the past 10 years of working inside this council, that showing anger only made the mockery worse. Humans were the new species here, dropped into a galaxy that had been trading, warring, and negotiating for tens of thousands of years before we ever built our first rocket. To them, we were the equivalent of a child who had wandered into an adult meeting, cute, harmless, beneath serious consideration. We were called Tier 9, observational status, the lowest ranking a species could hold and still be allowed inside council space. It meant we could listen, but we could not vote. It meant our fleet, all 3 of our aging warships, existed only because the council found it charming that we still tried. I looked back at the screen. The Kesserin Belt was not just any patch of rock and ice floating in space. It sat inside the boundary lines Earth had marked as its own territory during our very first treaty signing. It was small, it was mostly empty, but it was ours, and everyone in this chamber had agreed to that boundary in writing. 2 days earlier, a Thren mining convoy had entered that belt without permission. I had filed a formal complaint. I had been told, politely, that the matter would be reviewed at the council's convenience. Convenience, in this chamber, usually meant never. Now there were reports of something firing back. Kaylor Vaughn turned toward me with a sound expression that might have been a smile on a human face, but on his was something closer to a predator baring its teeth. "Liaison Osei," he said, letting my title roll off his tongue slowly, mockingly. "Perhaps you would like to explain why your species has decided to threaten one of our vessels over a few asteroids nobody was using." I stood up because sitting down while he spoke felt like agreeing with him. "That belt belongs to Earth, under the treaty signed in this very chamber," I said, keeping my voice level. "Your convoy entered without clearance. I filed the complaint myself." "A complaint," he repeated, and the room laughed again. "How very civilized of you. And now your little ships have opened fire." I did not have an answer for that, because I genuinely did not know what was happening. Nobody had briefed me. Nobody ever briefed me on military matters, because as far as the council was concerned, humanity did not have military matters worth briefing. A Kolovax trade delegate, a tall insectile being named Ressa Tho, leaned toward the central microphone with her 4 hands folded in front of her. "Perhaps this is a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "Perhaps the humans simply do not understand how our mining operations function. They are, after all, very new to space." New to space. I had heard that phrase so many times I could recite it in my sleep. It did not matter that humanity had survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and 100 other disasters that would have wiped out lesser species entirely. To this room, none of that mattered, because we had only been flying between stars for a decade. I sat back down as the council moved on to other business, dismissing the incident as a border misunderstanding that would be resolved through the usual channels. Usual channels meant paperwork. Usual channels meant waiting months while the Thren quietly continued mining whatever they wanted. But something in my gut told me this was different. The way the room had gone quiet for just a second, before the laughter started. the tiny flicker of information denied to me on my own console. Somebody, somewhere, was hiding something, and for the first time in 10 years, I was not sure it was the council doing the hiding. That evening, I walked the long corridor back to the human delegation quarters, past murals depicting 1,000 years of council history, past statues of species who had earned their seats through conquest, diplomacy, or sheer stubborn survival. I used to feel small in that corridor. That night, I felt something else. I felt like I was walking past history that was about to change. When I reached our quarters, I found the door locked from the inside, which had never happened before. I pressed my palm against the scanner and waited. It took nearly 30 seconds for it to open, and when it did, I found our senior delegate, a quiet man named Daniel Cole, standing in front of a wall of screens I had never been allowed to see. "Maya," he said, not looking surprised at all to see me. "Close the door." I did. The screens behind him showed tactical readouts, ship diagrams, energy signatures, none of which I had ever been given clearance to view. My mind raced through every polite explanation and found none of them fit. "What is this?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Daniel exhaled slowly, the way people do when they are about to hand you a weight they have carried alone for a long time. "This is what we have actually been doing for the last 10 years, he said, while the council was laughing at us. I stared at the screens. Weapon schematics, shield configurations, fleet movements that did not match the 3 ships the council believed we had. "They think we have 3 warships," I said slowly. "We have 3 warships in the registry," Daniel said. "The council only sees what we choose to show them." I felt something cold settle in my chest, not fear exactly, but the sudden awareness that I had been standing in a room full of predators while believing I was simply a curiosity. I thought of Kaylor Vaughn's smile, of Ressa Tho's soft mocking tone, of every delegate who had ever patted my species on the head like an obedient animal. "The convoy that got fired on," I said, "that was not an accident, was it?" Daniel met my eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that was not patience or diplomacy. It was resolve. "No," he said quietly. "That was the first move." Outside the window, the false stars of the council's artificial sky glittered on, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. I stood there a long moment, feeling the shape of the next few days settle over me like a held breath. Somewhere out past those painted stars, real ships were moving, real decisions were being made, and for the first time since humanity had walked into this chamber as the smallest, weakest, most laughed-at species in the room, I understood that we had never actually been as helpless as everyone believed. I just had not been told the truth, not until now. I did not sleep that night. I sat awake replaying every meeting, every mocking comment, every dismissed complaint, searching for the moments I had missed the signs. There had been small things, requisition requests that never matched the ships we officially owned, scientists who disappeared from public records for months at a time, trade agreements for materials that had no obvious use in civilian technology. I had noticed these things and explained them away, because it was easier to believe we were simply a struggling new species trying to keep up, rather than believe my own government had been quietly building something far larger behind a curtain of manufactured weakness. By morning, an emergency session had been called. I walked into the grand chamber and felt the shift in the air immediately. The mockery from the day before had thinned into something sharper, something more careful. The Thren mining convoy had not simply been fired upon. It had been disabled entirely, its shields collapsed, its engines dead in space, without a single fatality reported. Precise, controlled, deliberate. Kaylor Vaughn stood at the podium, his silver eyes no longer gleaming with amusement. His voice, when it came, had lost its mocking edge. "The ascendancy demands an explanation," he said. "Immediately." I stood at the human delegation table, aware that every eye in the chamber had turned toward me again, but this time the weight behind those stares felt different. It was not curiosity anymore. It was calculation. I did not have my instructions yet. I did not know what Earth intended to say. So I did the only thing I could do. I stood, straightened my jacket, and said the only true thing I knew. Earth will respond through official channels, I said. Within 72 hours, the chamber fell into a silence I had never heard it hold before. 72 hours. I had said the words without knowing what they meant, and now I had to live inside them, waiting like everyone else for whatever Earth intended to do next. The morning after the emergency session, I was summoned to a room I did not know existed. It sat 3 levels below the human delegation quarters, accessible only through a corridor disguised as a maintenance shaft. Daniel Cole led me there himself, saying nothing until the door sealed behind us. Inside, I found people I recognized and people I did not. A woman named Priya Nair stood at the center of the room, surrounded by displays that made the ones in Daniel's quarters look simple by comparison. She wore the insignia of Earth's Deep Space Engineering Corps, a division I had always assumed handled satellite maintenance and communication relays. Nothing about her posture suggested satellites. "Liaison Osei," she said, extending a hand. "It is good to finally have you here." "Finally," I repeated. I did not know there was a here to be at. Priya allowed herself a small, tired smile. That was rather the point. She gestured toward the largest display, where a diagram of Earth's actual fleet unfolded before me. Not 3 ships. 41. Not obsolete engines, but drive systems built from technology the Council had refused to share with us, technology our own engineers had studied, dismantled, and improved upon in secret over the last decade. How? I asked, because it was the only word I could manage. "You know how the Council treats new species," Priya said. "Observation status, limited trade access, no weapons technology, no advanced propulsion, nothing that might make us dangerous. They believed that keeping us weak kept us safe for everyone else. And instead," Daniel said, stepping in beside her, "it gave us 10 years to work without anyone watching closely enough to notice." I stared at the display, at the outline of ships bearing names I had never heard spoken aloud in any council session: the Kestrel, the Meridian, the Halcyon. Names that belonged to a fleet the entire galaxy believed did not exist. "Why?" I asked. "Why keep this from your own liaison? I have spent 10 years defending our reputation in that chamber." Priya's expression softened, and for a moment I saw not a soldier or an engineer, but simply a person carrying a heavy secret. "Because you needed to believe it," she said. "Every meeting, every insult, every dismissed complaint, your outrage was real, and that realness protected the truth better than any lie could have. If you had known, some part of you might have let it show. The Council reads body language across 1,000 species. They cannot read yours as well as they think they can, but they can read enough." I sat down slowly in the nearest chair, trying to absorb the shape of what she was telling me. 10 years of humiliation had not just been endured, it had been used, carefully, as camouflage. "The convoy," I said, "the one that got disabled, that was the Kestrel." "The Meridian, actually," Priya corrected gently. "The Kestrel is currently stationed near our home system, in case the Thren decide to retaliate directly." "Will they?" Daniel and Priya exchanged a glance that told me they had already discussed this many times. "The Thren ascendancy built their reputation on strength," Daniel said. "They cannot simply walk away from a defeat, even a small one, without losing standing among the other factions. They will need to respond. The question is how." I thought of Kaelor Vaughn's silver eyes, the way they had shifted from mockery to calculation in a single session. I did not think he was a man who accepted losses quietly. "What happens in 72 hours?" I asked. "What did I actually promise them?" Priya activated another display, and I found myself looking at the text of a formal notice, drafted in the careful, layered language the Council required for official communications. It was addressed to the Thren ascendancy. It demanded the immediate and permanent withdrawal of all mining operations from Earth's declared territory. It cited 3 separate treaty violations, each backed by documentation I had never seen before, gathered quietly over years by people I had never met. If they refuse, I said, reading further, this document authorizes further action. It does, Daniel said. Further action meaning? Priya did not answer directly. Instead, she pulled up one final display, a star map showing the region surrounding the Kesserin belt. Small markers, dozens of them, spread across the space beyond Earth's official border, positioned just outside what any Thren sensor sweep would flag as unusual. I understood then that this was not a threat. It was already a fact. Whatever was going to happen in the Kesserin belt had already been decided. The 72 hours were not a negotiation window. They were a courtesy, extended to a species that had never extended one to us. Does the Council know any of this? I asked. No, Daniel said. And they will not, until it is far too late to matter. I spent the rest of that day walking the council halls in a kind of daze, greeting delegates I had spoken with for years, listening to their theories about the incident with a new and unsettling clarity. A Vashtar curator named Ilyen Kest, one of the oldest beings in the chamber, approached me near the observation deck overlooking the false stars. The Vashtar were unlike any other faction in the council. They did not seek territory or trade advantage. They existed, as far as anyone understood, purely to preserve balance, stepping in only when conflicts threatened to destabilize the wider galaxy. Their neutrality had lasted so long that most species had stopped wondering what might finally break it. You seem troubled, Liaison, Ilyen said, her voice carrying the strange layered quality all Vashtar speech had, as though several voices were speaking the same words at slightly different times. I am simply tired, I said, which was true, if incomplete. The Thren believe your species acted out of desperation, she said, a wounded animal lashing out before it is put down. And what do you believe? Ilyen studied me for a long moment with eyes the color of deep water. I believe, she said slowly, that desperation and precision rarely occur in the same action. Your people disabled that convoy without a single casualty. That is not desperation, Liaison Osei. That is control. I did not answer her, because I did not trust myself to speak without confirming something I was not yet permitted to confirm. She seemed to understand this, and simply nodded once before continuing down the corridor, leaving me alone with the weight of her observation. That night, I returned to the hidden room beneath the delegation quarters and found it busier than before. Additional officers had arrived, their uniforms bearing insignias from divisions I had never encountered. A man named Ethan Brooks briefed a room of nearly 20 people on projected Thren response patterns, using data pulled from a decade of quiet surveillance the Council had never detected. Their fleet doctrine relies heavily on faster-than-light retreat capability, Ethan explained, pointing to a diagram of Thren ship classes. Every engagement they plan for includes an exit route. Remove that option, and their entire strategic approach collapses. Can we remove it? Someone asked from the back of the room. Ethan allowed himself a small, confident smile, the kind of expression I had never once seen on a human face inside the Grand Chamber, because inside that chamber, humans were never permitted to look confident. We already have, he said. The dead zone around the Kesserin belt was not a natural phenomenon. It took us 6 years to build the field generators that created it, disguised as mining safety equipment. Any ship entering that region loses faster-than-light capability the moment it crosses the boundary. I stared at him, at the room full of quiet, capable people who had spent a decade constructing a trap so patient and so thorough that an entire advanced civilization had walked into it without noticing. The convoy, I said. It was never really about the convoy. No, Priya said, stepping up beside me. The convoy was bait, a small, expendable target designed to provoke exactly the kind of retaliation the Thren are known for. Aggressive, overwhelming force, sent without full reconnaissance, because they never believed we were capable of anything more than what they had already seen. I thought of Kaylor Vaughn again, of his certainty, his contempt, his absolute conviction that humanity could not possibly pose a real threat. I understood now that this conviction was not simply an insult to be endured. It was a weapon Earth had been sharpening for 10 years, and the Thren Ascendancy had just handed us the perfect moment to use it. "When does the deadline expire?" I asked. Daniel checked the time on his wrist device, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw the faint shadow of nerves cross his composed expression. 6 hours, he said. Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. Somewhere above us, the false stars of the Council's artificial sky continued their slow, indifferent rotation, unaware that beneath their painted light, an entire galaxy was about to discover exactly how wrong it had been about the smallest, most laughed-at species in the chamber. I stayed in that room until the deadline passed, watching the seconds tick down on a display that showed no dramatic countdown, no flashing warning, nothing but a quiet, patient clock reaching 0. When it did, nothing appeared to happen at all. No alarms sounded. No new alerts flashed across the Council's monitoring systems. For nearly 20 minutes, I began to wonder if the entire plan had simply failed to activate. Then Ethan's console lit up with a single line of text, relayed from a listening post disguised among the debris fields near the Kesserin belt. "Thren mining fleet has gone dark," it read. No response to hailing signals, no faster-than-light signatures detected. Priya turned to me, and for the first time since I had walked into that hidden room, I saw something that looked almost like relief cross her tired features. "It has begun," she said quietly. I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something quieter and stranger, the sensation of standing at the edge of a decade-long held breath, finally released. 10 years of mockery, of dismissed complaints, of watching my species treated as a curiosity too small to matter, had all been leading toward this single, silent moment, hidden from the eyes of an entire galaxy that still believed it understood exactly what humanity was. They were about to learn otherwise. The first reports out of the Kesserin belt arrived in fragments, broken sentences relayed through channels that were never meant to be shared with a Council liaison, but Priya let me listen anyway, standing beside her as the hidden room filled with the tense, clipped voices of officers doing their jobs under enormous pressure. I learned later that the operation had begun 3 hours before the deadline expired, not after, because Ethan's teams had calculated that the Thren convoy would attempt a defensive regrouping the moment the 72-hour notice was formally logged in Council records. Rather than wait for that regrouping to strengthen their position, Earth's fleet moved first, quietly, entering the dead zone under cover of the very mining equipment the Thren believed was harmless. A woman named Grace Whitfield commanded the Kestrel that day, and her voice, relayed through the console speakers, carried none of the fear I might have expected from someone facing down a fleet that outnumbered her ships nearly 3-1. "All vessels confirm dead zone activation," she said. "Thren convoy faster-than-light drives are offline. Repeat, offline." I watched Priya exhale slowly beside me, though her eyes never left the display. "That is the easy part," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Now comes the hard part." I did not understand what she meant until the tactical display updated, showing the Thren convoy's full formation for the first time. It was not simply a mining fleet. Somewhere in the last day, the Ascendancy had reinforced the convoy with 3 heavy cruisers, vessels far more dangerous than anything Earth had previously engaged in open conflict. "They reinforced," I said. "They knew something was coming." "They suspected retaliation for the disabled convoy," Daniel said, appearing at my shoulder. "They did not suspect this." On the display, Earth's ships began moving into position, not in the aggressive frontal formation I might have expected from old films or games, but in a wide, careful pattern that seemed almost gentle by comparison. I asked Ethan why, and he explained without looking away from his console. "Their cruisers rely on layered shielding," he said. 3 overlapping fields, each one compensating for weaknesses in the others. It took our engineers years to find the resonance frequency that collapses all three layers at once. We are not attacking their hull. We are attacking their shields precisely so their systems fail before anyone gets hurt. I watched the display shift again, small markers indicating Earth vessels adjusting position with a precision that looked almost choreographed. Grace Whitfield's voice returned to the channel, steady and unhurried. Kestrel to all vessels. Beginning resonance sequence in 3, 2, 1. For a long moment, nothing on the display seemed to change at all. Then, one by one, the shield indicators on the three Thren cruisers began to flicker, their steady green status shifting to a warning amber, then finally to a dull red that meant failure. Shields down on all three cruisers, Ethan confirmed, his voice tight with focus rather than excitement. No weapons discharge detected from our side. Repeat, no weapons discharge. I turned to Priya, confused. You disabled 3 heavy cruisers without firing a single shot. That was always the plan, she said. A fleet with no shields and no faster-than-light capability is a fleet that has already lost, whether it realizes it yet or not. We do not need to destroy them to win. We only need them to understand that they cannot win against us. I thought of Kaelor Vaughn's silver eyes again and wondered what expression they might be wearing in this moment, receiving the news that his reinforced convoy had been stripped of every advantage it possessed, without a single casualty to justify a counterattack. The Thren response, when it came, was immediate and predictable. Weapons fire lit up the tactical display, the cruisers attempting to strike back despite their compromised shields, desperate to salvage some measure of the engagement before it slipped entirely out of their control. I gripped the edge of the console as the display showed Earth vessels absorbing the impacts. Hull integrity holding, Grace's voice reported, calm even as the numbers on the display ticked downward slightly. Minor damage across 3 vessels. No casualties. They are still fighting, I said. They do not know how to stop, Daniel said quietly. Their entire military culture is built around never yielding once combat begins. It is a strength most of the time. Today, it will simply prolong the inevitable. I watched the engagement continue for nearly 20 more minutes, the Thren cruisers firing everything they had left, while Earth's ships maneuvered around them, with a patience that felt almost cruel in its restraint. Several times I saw openings on the display where Earth vessels could have delivered a devastating counterstrike, weaknesses in the Thren formation that any aggressive commander might have exploited. Each time, Earth's ships held back, content to simply outlast the assault rather than escalate it. Why aren't we finishing this? I finally asked. Priya turned to me, and for the first time, I saw genuine conviction in her expression rather than simple professional focus. Because how we win matters as much as whether we win, she said. If we destroy 3 cruisers today, the story the galaxy tells tomorrow is that humanity is dangerous and violent, exactly the narrative the Thren would use to justify further aggression against us. If we simply outlast them, disable them, and let them surrender on their own terms, the story becomes something else entirely. It becomes proof that we did not need to destroy anyone to win. I understood then the depth of the strategy unfolding around me. This was not simply a military operation. It was a message, crafted as carefully as any diplomatic speech, designed to be understood by every faction in the council watching the outcome unfold. The Thren cruisers, their weapons finally exhausted and their shields still failed, went silent almost 40 minutes after the engagement began. Grace Whitfield's voice returned to the channel, and this time I heard something in it that had not been there before, a quiet note of hard-won relief. Thren vessels have ceased weapons discharge, she reported, requesting confirmation on next steps. Daniel looked toward Priya, who nodded once. Offer them tow assistance out of the dead zone, she said. Full transparency with council observers. Let them see exactly how this ends. I felt something shift in my chest as those words registered. Tow assistance. Not destruction. Not humiliation beyond what had already occurred. A simple, almost generous offer extended to the very fleet that had entered our territory without permission days earlier. "They will refuse," I said. "They might," Priya agreed, "but the offer will be recorded, and every delegate in that chamber will eventually see the transcript. That matters more than whether they accept it." I stood in that hidden room for another hour, watching the aftermath unfold in careful, measured steps. The Thren commander, a woman whose name I would later learn was Sarix Khan, initially refused the assistance, her pride clearly unwilling to accept help from a species she had spent her entire career considering beneath serious military concern. But as the hours passed and her stranded cruisers drifted without power inside the dead zone, practical necessity eventually overcame pride, and she requested the tow assistance through official council channels rather than direct communication with Earth's fleet, a small but telling detail that Priya pointed out to me with a faint, tired smile. "She still cannot bring herself to speak to us directly," Priya said. "That will change soon enough." By the time the sun rose over the council's artificial sky the next morning, the story had already begun spreading through every delegation on the station, though the full details remained locked behind layers of official confirmation and denial. I walked into the grand chamber that day and felt an entirely different atmosphere than the one I had left less than 2 days earlier. The mockery was gone. In its place sat something far more unfamiliar to me, a room full of species who had spent their entire history categorizing threats by size, technology, and reputation, suddenly confronted with a species that fit none of their established categories. Kaylor Vaughn was not present in the chamber that morning, and his absence spoke louder than any statement he might have made. In his place sat a junior Thren officer, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of representing an ascendancy that had just suffered its first documented military defeat in over 3 centuries, a defeat delivered by a species they had dismissed as harmless less than a week before. I took my seat at the human delegation table, aware once again that every eye in the chamber had turned toward me, but this time the silence that followed carried none of the amusement from before. It carried something closer to caution, the kind of careful attention species reserved for things they no longer fully understood. For the first time in 10 years, nobody in that chamber was laughing. The emergency session that followed was unlike any council meeting I had attended in a decade of service. Delegates arrived early, whispering among themselves in corridors, usually filled with the slow, unhurried confidence of species who believed nothing could truly surprise them anymore. That confidence had cracked, and I could see it in the way even the most powerful factions kept glancing toward the human delegation table, as though searching for some visible sign of the strength that had just humbled a Thren war fleet without a single confirmed casualty. Ressa Tho, the Kolovax trade delegate who had once dismissed our complaint, with a smooth, condescending smile, now sat with her 4 hands folded tightly together, saying nothing as the chamber filled around her. Her silence told me more than any speech could have. The junior Thren officer, whose name I learned was Doran Vale, stood at the podium looking as though he would have preferred to be almost anywhere else in the galaxy. His voice, when he finally spoke, lacked the booming confidence Kaylor Vaughn had always carried into this chamber. "The ascendancy requests a formal explanation," he said, reading from a prepared statement that trembled slightly in his grip, "regarding the unauthorized use of restricted field technology against a lawfully operating mining convoy." I stood, because someone had to answer, and Daniel had given me clear instructions before the session began. I was to speak plainly, without apology, and without the careful diplomatic softening I had used for 10 years to smooth over every insult directed at my species. "The technology was not restricted," I said. "It was developed independently by Earth, using research conducted entirely within our own territory. The convoy in question was not operating lawfully. It had entered space clearly marked as Earth's sovereign territory under the treaty this council itself witnessed being signed a decade ago." A murmur spread through the chamber, delegates leaning toward each other, exchanging quiet words in a dozen different languages. I felt the weight of every gaze in that room, but for the first time, I did not feel small beneath it. Ilien Kest, The Vashtar curator who had spoken to me quietly on the observation deck days earlier, rose from her seat with the slow, deliberate movement that marked every action her species took. The chamber fell silent almost instantly, because when a Vashtar curator chose to speak, every faction understood the wisdom in listening carefully. "I would remind this chamber," she said, her layered voice carrying easily across the vast space, that the treaty establishing Earth's territorial boundary was ratified unanimously, including by the Thrin Ascendancy. A mining convoy, entering that territory without clearance, is by the Council's own established law an act of trespass. Whether the response to that trespass was proportionate is a separate question, and one worth examining carefully, but the initial violation belongs entirely to the Ascendancy. Doran Vale's composure faltered visibly under the weight of her statement. I watched him glance toward the empty seat where Kaelor Vaughn usually sat, as though hoping the Admiral might suddenly appear to rescue him from a conversation he clearly was not prepared to navigate alone. "The response was disproportionate," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Restricted field technology was deployed against Ascendancy vessels without warning. I felt Priya's earlier words echo in my mind, the careful reasoning behind every decision made during the engagement, and I understood exactly how to answer this challenge. There was a warning," I said. "A formal notice was delivered 72 hours before any action was taken, demanding withdrawal from Earth's declared territory. That notice is a matter of Council record, filed through proper channels, and witnessed by this very chamber during the previous session." Doran Vale had no response to that, because there was none to give. The record spoke for itself, and everyone present had heard me deliver that warning myself, standing at this very table, less than 3 days earlier. A new voice entered the discussion then, one I recognized from years of quiet, unremarkable presence within the Council. Marcus Doyle, a delegate from a smaller faction called the Varan Compact, a species that had spent decades navigating the Council's hierarchy through careful neutrality rather than open strength, raised his voice for the first time in any session I had attended. "If I may," he said, and the chamber turned toward him with evident surprise, since the Varan Compact rarely spoke on matters not directly affecting their own interests. "This chamber has spent a decade treating Earth as a species without meaningful capability. I confess I shared that assumption, but the events of the past days suggest a serious miscalculation on the part of this Council, one that deserves honest examination rather than deflection toward blame." I watched several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus Doyle's willingness to speak plainly seemed to open a door that others had been waiting for someone else to open first. "The Ascendancy demanded an explanation," he continued, "but perhaps the more important question is why this Council believed it understood a species it had never bothered to properly assess. 10 years of observation status, and not once did any faction in this chamber conduct a genuine review of Earth's actual capabilities. We accepted appearances as fact, and appearances, it seems, were carefully constructed." Ressa Tho finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You suggest they deceived us." "I suggest," Marcus Doyle said, "that we deceived ourselves and mistook our own assumptions for evidence." I felt something settle in my chest as his words landed across the chamber, a quiet vindication I had not expected to feel in that moment. For 10 years, I had defended my species against assumptions I could not disprove, because the truth had been hidden even from me. Now, watching the Council's own members begin questioning those assumptions aloud, I understood that the strategy Priya and Daniel had built extended far beyond a single military engagement. It had been designed to force exactly this kind of reckoning. Doran Vale, clearly out of his depth, attempted one final argument. Regardless of the circumstances, this Council cannot simply allow a Tier 9 species to act with impunity against an established power. Precedent must be maintained. I stood again, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment Daniel had specifically prepared me to meet. "Earth is not asking for impunity," I said. "Earth is asking for the same standard this Council applies to every other member species, a territorial boundary that is respected, a treaty violation that carries consequences, a response that was proportionate, documented, and delivered without a single fatality on either side. If this council believes that standards should not apply equally to a Tier 9 species, then perhaps the classification itself deserves reconsideration, rather than the actions taken to defend it. The chamber fell into a silence that stretched long enough to feel physical. I remained standing, aware that my voice had carried further than I intended, aware that for the first time in a decade I had spoken to this council not as a supplicant seeking tolerance, but as a representative demanding recognition of an equal standard. Ilian Kest rose once more, and the chamber turned to her with the same reflexive attention it always offered the Vashtar. "This council will convene a formal review of Earth's classification status," she said. "Given the events of the past days, continuing to categorize this species as Tier 9 observational appears increasingly difficult to justify on any objective basis." I watched the reaction ripple across the chamber, delegates exchanging glances that carried decades of assumption unraveling in real time. Even Ressa Tho, who had spent years treating our complaints with polite dismissal, now regarded me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not warmth. It was something closer to reassessment, the careful recalculation of a species deciding whether an old assumption still served their interests. The session ended without further resolution that day, but I understood, walking out of that chamber, that something fundamental had already shifted. The mockery that had defined every interaction I witnessed for 10 years had not simply quieted. It had been replaced by a wariness that no amount of diplomatic smoothing would ever fully erase. Daniel met me outside the chamber doors, his expression carrying the same quiet satisfaction I had seen in Priya during the engagement itself. "You did well," he said. "I only said what should have been said years ago," I replied. "Perhaps," he said. "But saying it after proving it means something entirely different than saying it before." I thought about that as we walked back toward the delegation quarters, past the murals depicting 1,000 years of council history, species who had earned their place through conquest, diplomacy, or stubborn survival. For the first time, I did not feel like a visitor walking through someone else's history. I felt like I was walking through the opening chapter of our own. The weeks that followed the emergency session unfolded slower than I expected, though nothing about the Council's new attitude toward Earth ever fully returned to what it had been before the Kesserin Belt engagement. The formal review Ilian Kest had announced took nearly a month to convene properly, and during that time I found myself invited into rooms and conversations I had never before been permitted to enter. The most significant of these came from an unexpected source. Sarix Khan, the Thren commander whose cruisers had been disabled and eventually towed clear of the dead zone, requested a private meeting with the human delegation, bypassing official channels entirely. Daniel brought me into that meeting himself, though he made clear beforehand that the decision to attend rested with me. "You do not have to be there," he said. "This is not an easy conversation for her, and it may not be an easy one for you either." I chose to attend because I wanted to understand what a defeated commander from a species that had spent 3 centuries without losing a major engagement actually thought about what had happened to her. Sarix Khan met us in a small private chamber near the edge of the station, far from the grandeur of the main council hall. She stood when we entered, a formality I had not expected from someone whose pride had clearly suffered as much as her fleet during the engagement. "I did not request this meeting to apologize," she said, her voice carrying none of Kaelor Vaughn's earlier arrogance, but also none of the humility I might have expected either. "I requested it because I wish to understand something I have not been able to explain to my own command." "What is that?" I asked. "You disabled 3 of my cruisers without firing a single lethal shot," she said. "You had every opportunity to destroy us entirely. Your fleet held every tactical advantage by the end of that engagement, and yet you offered us assistance rather than pressing that advantage. I have spent 3 centuries studying warfare across a dozen cultures, and I have never encountered a doctrine that behaves this way." I glanced at Daniel, who nodded once, indicating I should answer this myself. "We did not fight you to destroy you," I said. "We fought you to prove a point, and destroying your fleet would have undermined that point entirely. If we had shown the galaxy that Earth responds to trespass with total annihilation, we would have confirmed every fear this council might reasonably hold about a species with capabilities it did not know existed. Instead, we wanted to show something else, that we can defend what belongs to us without needing to become a threat to everyone around us." Sarix Khan studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable in a way that reminded me of every alien delegate I had ever struggled to interpret during my years in the chamber. "That is either the wisest strategy I have encountered in my career," she said finally, "or the most dangerous one, because a species capable of that kind of restraint, after that kind of victory, is far more unsettling than one who simply destroys everything in its path." I did not have an answer for that, because I suspected she was right on both counts. The formal review, when it finally convened, produced changes to Earth's council status that exceeded even what Daniel and Priya had privately hoped for. Our classification shifted from Tier 9 observational to a newly created category the Council had never used before, a status reserved for species whose capabilities had been formally underestimated and required immediate reassessment. Along with the new classification came something far more significant than a simple label change. Earth was granted a full voting seat within the Council, the first time in the institution's recorded history that a species had moved from observational status to full membership in less than a single decade. I sat in the chamber the day that decision was formally announced, watching delegates who had once laughed openly at humanity's presence now offer careful, measured congratulations, their words polite, but their eyes betraying the wariness that had settled over every interaction with our delegation since the Kesserin Belt engagement. Kaylor Vaughn returned to the chamber for that session, his silver eyes carrying none of the mockery they once held. He approached our table after the announcement, and I braced myself for whatever confrontation might follow. "Liaison Ose," he said, his voice measured in a way I had never heard from him before. "The Ascendancy formally acknowledges the territorial boundary established by prior treaty and will withdraw all remaining operations from the region in question." "Thank you," I said, choosing my words carefully, aware that this moment mattered beyond the simple exchange of formalities. He hesitated before turning away, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his expression that might have been genuine curiosity rather than calculation. 10 years, he said quietly. 10 years we watched your species and believed we understood exactly what we were looking at. I find myself wondering now how many other assumptions this council has never bothered to question." He left without waiting for a response, and I understood that his final words were not directed at me alone, but at every delegate who had ever mistaken humanity's patience for weakness. In the months that followed, I watched Earth's new position within the Council reshape not just our own standing, but the broader balance of power across the entire chamber. Species that had previously ignored our delegation now sought quiet meetings, careful alliances, cautious trade agreements offered with a respect that had never existed before. The Varan Compact, led by Marcus Doyle, became one of our closest allies within the Council, their earlier willingness to question the room's assumptions creating a natural foundation for cooperation between our two delegations. I met with Priya and Ethan and Grace Whitfield several times during those months, each conversation revealing new layers of the decade-long strategy that had led to that single, quiet engagement near the Kesserin Belt. I learned that the field generators disguised as mining equipment had been developed in complete secrecy, funded through budgets buried so deeply within civilian infrastructure spending that even most of Earth's own government representatives had no idea what they were actually paying for. I learned that pilots like Grace had trained for years on simulations of engagements that might never occur, preparing for a moment none of them could be certain would ever actually arrive. "Did you always believe it would work?" I asked Grace during one of these conversations, sitting in a quiet corner of the delegation quarters that had once felt too small for the weight of the secrets it held. She considered the question carefully before answering, I believed we had done the work necessary to give ourselves the best possible chance. Whether the Council would respond the way we hoped, whether the Thren would react the way our models predicted, none of that was ever certain. We simply prepared as thoroughly as we could, and trusted that preparation to carry us through whatever uncertainty remained. I thought about that answer often in the weeks that followed, because it captured something essential about the entire strategy that had unfolded around me. Nothing about what Earth had done was reckless or impulsive. It was the product of a decade of patient, careful work, hidden behind a curtain of manufactured weakness that had fooled an entire galaxy of species far older and more experienced than we were. Ilian Kest sought me out one final time before the formal transition of Earth's Council status was completed, finding me on the same observation deck where she had first questioned me about the nature of desperation and precision. "You seem different than the liaison I met months ago," she said, studying me with those deep water eyes. "I suppose I understand my own species differently than I did before," I said. "That is the nature of revelation," she said. "It does not simply change what others believe about you. It changes what you believe about yourself." I considered her words as I looked out over the false stars of the Council's artificial sky, thinking of everything that had led to this moment. 10 years of quiet mockery, endured because the alternative would have exposed a secret that needed exactly that mockery to survive. A decade of careful preparation, hidden behind obsolete ships and dismissed complaints, waiting patiently for a moment that might never have come at all. A single, controlled engagement that cost no lives but changed everything about how an entire galaxy understood the smallest, most laughed-at species in its chamber. "Do you regret how it happened?" Ilian asked. "The deception, the years of pretending to be less than you were." I thought carefully before answering, because the question deserved an honest response rather than a diplomatic one. "I regret that it was necessary," I said. "I do not regret that we were capable of it. There is a difference, I think, between choosing to hide strength out of fear and choosing to hide it out of patience, waiting for the moment when revealing it would matter most." Ilian nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, something that might have been respect settled into her ancient, unreadable expression. "The galaxy has existed for a very long time," she said. "Species come and go, rise and fall, and most believe they understand the shape of power long before they actually do. Your species has taught this council something it desperately needed to learn, even if the lesson arrived through methods some might find uncomfortable. Strength is not always visible in the moment it matters most. Sometimes it waits, quietly, until the world is ready to see it." I stood beside her for a long while after that, watching the artificial stars continue their slow, indifferent rotation, thinking of everything my species had endured to reach this moment, and everything that still lay ahead of us now that the galaxy finally understood what we had always known about ourselves, even when no one else believed it. We were never as small as they thought we were. We simply chose, for exactly as long as we needed to let them believe otherwise. And when the moment finally came to prove them wrong, we did not do it with anger, or cruelty, or the kind of overwhelming force that would have confirmed every fear a cautious galaxy might have held about us. We did it with patience, precision, and a restraint that unsettled our former mockers more deeply than any show of aggression ever could have. 10 years of being underestimated had taught us exactly how to use that underestimation as our greatest advantage. And when Earth finally struck back, the entire Galactic Council learned, in the space of a single quiet engagement, that the species they had spent a decade laughing at had simply been waiting for the right moment to stop laughing along with them.